Welcome everybody to the Reader's Rampant. Great. Up in Sister Bay. Today we're here with the author, Charlie Lovett, who is a best-selling novelist, a bibliophile, podcast producer, children's playwright, and an expert on all the works and life of Lewis Carroll. He hosts the podcast Inside the Writer's Studio about writers, their lives, their craft, and their latest work. Charlie is the author of The Bookman's Tale, which we discussed at our book club in 2014. It's a mystery about William Shakespeare. That book was a Barnes & Noble recommended title in 2013, a New York Times bestseller, and a USA Today bestseller. He's also the author of First Impressions, which we discussed at this book group in 2015 about Jane Austen. And his book, The Lost Book of the Grail, we discussed in 2017 in this book club. It's obviously about the mystery of the Holy Grail. Today's discussion is about the most recent book by Charlie, Escaping Dreamland, which was published in September 2020. The novel tells the story of 4 writers living in New York City, 1 in 2010 and 3 in 1906. In a surprising way, their works influence each other's lives. So welcome, Charlie.
Thank you. Let me just fix my view here. Okay. Thank you for having me. Thank you for reading my books. I really appreciate it. I was saying earlier, I looked up on the map today to see where I was going to be appearing and immediately started looking for hotels and when can I go? It just looks like a beautiful place. So hopefully we'll do this all in person, for the next book. But so I want to talk a little bit about Escaping Dreamland and some of my reactions to it. One of the things that's really occurred to me over the last what's now been almost 2 years or 18 months, I guess, that we've all been living in this other world, is that I've always believed very strongly that the writing of a novel or the creating of any other sort of work of art is really only the first half of creating a work of art. And until you sit down and read the book, that creative act isn't completed. And every time somebody reads the book, they have a different creative experience because we all bring to a book different thoughts, different ideas, different backgrounds. I mean, I think it's the same thing with a painting. I don't think a painting is beautiful until somebody looks at it. And so this is just ink and paper until somebody opens it and reads it. And I think where we are in our lives can dictate what kind of experience we have. I mean, I know we all have books that we're particularly fond of. And I think a lot of times our favorite books are books that we recall the original experience of reading the book as being special. We were on vacation. It was a great time in our lives, or that book spoke to us where we happened to be emotionally at that particular time in our lives, and it became a favorite. And I've had several different reactions to this book myself that I'd like to share with you. So when I wrote the book, I was partly writing about my own childhood, about having grown up reading these children's series books like the Hardy Boys and similar books. And also having discovered that my grandfather read the same books. In fact, when I was working on this book, I read some of his copies of some of these early children's series books published by the Stratemeyer Syndicate. And in fact, this one, you can still see his childhood book plate there in the front of the book. And so that was kind of the first impetus for the book, was wanting to kind of pay tribute to these children's series books that, while I would never argue that they're great literature, I would argue that they have an important place in our culture because there's so many generations of us first got excited about reading through these types of books. But I also was writing a novel about the emotional landscape of identity, how we explore our own identities and how we deal with those moments when what we see as our identity is at odds with what society or the greater world wants to see as our identity. And this shows up a lot of different places in the book. I mean, it shows up, I suppose, most obviously in the character of Jean, who is struggling with gender identity and sexual orientation, but also with a character like Magda, who wants to be an independent woman in 1906 in New York City, or a character like Robert, who people make certain assumptions about him because he's a successful novelist, and he feels like those assumptions are at odds with who he really is. So I felt like I was writing a novel about identity, about love, about friendship, and about this world of children's books. So then I came back to that's what I thought when I was writing the book in sort of beginning in 2016, 2017, kind of in that time period. Then you came back, after you've gotten the whole thing written and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And I came back to it in the editing process. Well, when I started to edit this book, doing the sort of the last rounds of edits, my father had just passed away. It was right before COVID. It was in early February of 2020. And all of a sudden I saw this as a book about, there's 4 main characters in this book. And for 3 of them, the death of their father is something pretty significant and something that either happens in the book or gets flashed back to before the book. I didn't really think about that at the time, but when I came back to read that book as someone who had just lost his father, that resonated very profoundly for me. And I had a whole different creative experience reading the book at that point. Then the book was published, and I started doing these kind of talks, and I started looking back at the book again, and it was the middle of COVID. And suddenly I thought, no, what this book is, this is a book about people overcoming the tragedies of their past. This is about, every one of the 4 main characters has a traumatic event in their past. And that was very intentional. I didn't stumble upon that. I wanted that to be the case. But as a society, as readers, we're trying to figure out how are we going to overcome this trauma of a global pandemic. The idea of this being a novel about people overcoming trauma and overcoming tragedies, both personal and societal, suddenly that was resonating very strongly with me. So I'm proud of the fact that it's a book that, at least for one reader, that reader being me, resonates in different ways at different times and meets me in different places where I happen to be at the time that I'm reading, and gives me a different creative experience. And hopefully each one of you has had a different creative experience, has had it resonate in a way that's different from the person who's sitting next to you, or different from the way it did for me. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the research that I did for this book, because there were just so many fun stories about the historical research. It was, the other novels that were mentioned earlier, especially I think about The Lost Book of the Grail. That book was set in a medieval cathedral. That's not a problem. There's plenty of medieval cathedrals all over England. I've been in lots of them, and I can just go sit in them and see this is what it feels like, and I can start writing a book that's set in that space. This book is set largely in the New York City of the early 20th century, which is not there anymore. There's a building here and there, but for the most part, it's gone. And even when you stand there and look at the Flatiron Building, the Flatiron Building is still there, but everything around it looks completely different than it did in 1906. And so it was a very different kind of research for me. It was about looking at old photographs, even some old film footage, especially old newspapers. I really was committed to the idea of wanting my readers to experience these historical events, not filtered through the eyes of a contemporary scholar, not somebody from the 1980s who wrote a book about this and did all this research. I wanted them to have the experience, the same sort of raw experience that a New Yorker in 1906 would have. And that meant the newspaper, and there were a lot of newspapers in New York at the time. And luckily those have all been digitized now. And so it was easy for me to sit at home and read the papers from 1906 and that time period. But one of the things I've always found in researching historical novels is one of these marvelous things, and I've talked on my podcast to other historical novelists who have said they've had similar experiences, is that you'll be working on the story and you'll want your character to have a certain experience, or to go to a certain place, or to have certain kind of interaction. And you start to do the research to sort of flesh that all out. And what you find in the historical research is so often so much better narratively than anything you ever would have made up or even had the courage to make up. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So the character Thomas DePeyster, Tom, who's a journalist, he's in San Francisco in April of 1906 when the earthquake hits, and he has a very traumatic experience, not surprisingly. as being in the middle of this incredibly tragic event where, a whole city was destroyed by earthquake and then by fire. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed. And he has a personal connection to that tragedy, but also he was just there in the streets. And then flash forward just a few months later, in September of that same year, he goes to the amusement park on Coney Island, after which the book is named, goes to Dreamland. And there was, at Dreamland, which opened in 1904, there was an attraction called Fighting the Flames. And this was one of these, it reminds me sort of the Indiana Jones show at Disney World. You kind of go and you sit in this outdoor amphitheater, and there's a street scene, and there's a building, and then suddenly the building is on fire and people are jumping out of the windows, and the firemen are coming and they put the fire out, and it's all very dramatic. And then they do it all again 30 minutes later. Well, marketing is just the same today as it was in 1906. And the clever people in 1906, between mid-April, when the earthquake hit, and late May, when Dreamland opened for the season, they completely re-choreographed, reconstructed, and rebranded Fighting the Flames, and it became the Great San Francisco Earthquake. And now you went in and you watched a vibrant city and a street scene, and then you saw all the buildings fall down, and you saw this recreation of this traumatic event. And I mean, I never would have dreamed of making this up. But as an author, the opportunity to take a character who's lived through this very dramatic and traumatic event and make him relive it as a sideshow entertainment, and then have the emotions that come with that, that's just narrative gold, really. And that all came right out of the research. And another one that I really liked was when Magda and Jean, and for those of you if there are people who haven't read the novel, Tom, Magda, and Jean are the three main characters in the 1906 timeline, and then there's a 2010 timeline that has a contemporary author named Robert. They're all writers, but the three 1906 writers are all writing these children's series books, and they become very close friends. And then they go to the Dreamland amusement park, and dramatic things happen at the amusement park. So a few months later, Magda and Jean meet up, and they're taking a walk, and I wanted to just walk down. It's Christmas time. I thought, what do I do in New York at Christmas? I walk down the street and I look at the displays in all the big department stores. I wonder if they did that in 1906. So I started to do the research, and yes, they had department store windows. It was in a different part of the city. It was in what was called the Ladies' Mile, which was sort of south of where the shopping district is now. So I just wanted to have them go for a walk and look in windows. And I started trying to find out what was in the windows. And lo and behold, at Christmas time, 1906, Siegel's department store in their windows had an entire diorama of Coney Island, including a whole window that was devoted to the Dreamland amusement park, a complete reconstruction of the park in tiny scale. And again, to have two characters who had this, without giving anything away, this very sort of strong, emotional, difficult moment at Dreamland a few months before, have to sort of re-encounter that space as a store decoration. It just gives you so many opportunities to kind of prod at their emotional core, and I like things that sort of turn back around on themselves, and it's just great when that, as often as that happens in the historical research. And so often when I wanted to try to just make little points about things, suddenly I would find something that wasn't a little point, it was a big point. When I wanted Magda to go to the circus, so there's a character, Jean, who, the whole world of what we would call homosexuality was completely different in 1906 than it is now. But Jean has worked at what's called a fairy resort, where he dresses in a very effeminate manner, and there are other people. It's not really drag, not what we would call drag today, or even cross-dressing, but it's just sort of more of an effeminate way of dressing. But Magda's going to go to the circus, and so I start reading up on the Barnum and Bailey Circus in New York City in 1906, and there's a family of acrobats. And I thought, okay, acrobats, I can get into that. maybe Magda decides to have the hero of the book that she's writing, be an acrobat. That'd be pretty cool. A child acrobat could do lots of heroic things, right? Because they can jump and they can spin. And so I start reading about this acrobatic family, and they talk about how the youngest member of the troupe was this little girl, and they would throw her up in the air and she would spin around and everything. And then I had to research a little deeper, and it turns out it wasn't a little girl. It was a little boy who dressed as a little girl. And that's a real historical fact that just sort of directly ties into an area that the novel is exploring narratively. So I just love those moments when you're doing the research and the historical record gives you so much more than you ever would have made up for yourself. And yet, if you ever start to feel, wait, this is too much, this is almost unbelievable, you can fall back on the fact that, well, it happened, so it's not unbelievable. We have to believe it. So the research was definitely a big part of the creation of this novel, and a part that I enjoyed a lot. So I don't want to go on really any longer. It's 10 till, and we said that I would talk for 15 or 20 minutes and then take questions. But I just want to sort of have you think about those 2 points about the way a historical novelist, the way our research interacts with our storytelling, and then also the way that your own background and the place that you are in your life at this moment is part of what creates a creative experience when you sit down to read a book or to watch a film or to go to an art museum or any other sort of creative act. So with that, I think I will open it up to questions. If you want to type questions into the chat window, you can do that, or I think you can just unmute yourself to ask questions. And all I would ask is that we may have some people who haven't read the book, so we'll steer clear of talking too much about spoilers in the late going. But other than that, I'm happy to talk about whatever you'd like to ask about.
Great, thank you.
How accurate were you with your facts about what happened in 1906?
Okay, so the question was how accurate was about my facts of what happened in 1906. Anything that is presented as a historical event is presented pretty much the way it happened. I tried to be as accurate as I possibly could. Sometimes you have to give up. I mean, I spent a whole day and a half trying to find out how much it costs to ride the elevated train from Greenwich Village up to 23rd Street, and I never could find out how much it costs. But then I figured, well, if I can't find out how much it costs, then my reader probably doesn't know how much it costs either. So there's certainly gaps, and you can't. I mean, it's not a history book. It's not intended to be a complete account of anything. It's a story about how these particular characters move through a historical period and how the events of that period affect these particular characters. So for instance, with the Slocum disaster, there's nothing that I write about the Slocum disaster that's not something that happened. But that doesn't mean that I wrote about everything that happened, because it's only the things that affect Magda that matter to this particular narrative. But I tried to stay as accurate as possible. I will say, another lens through which I have viewed this narrative is one now where I'm working with a group of theater professionals to develop a stage play based on Escaping Dreamland. And with that, we are actually being a little more loosey-goosey with the timeline and things like that, because just, you can't have a stage play that lasts for 25 years, so we've had to sort of compact some of the things that have happened, and but I don't think we're being wildly inaccurate. We're just doing what plays and films do, taking a historical reality and then manipulating it in a way that we can tell the story in a 2-hour time frame. But as far as the book goes, I tried very hard to be as accurate as I could. And there are even places where I took language directly out of the newspapers, especially in the description of the Slocum disaster. There's whole sentences in there that I lifted straight out of the newspapers, because for one thing, I wanted to catch that flavor, but I also wanted to be sure that I was using the language the same way the language was being used in 1906. So if I can take a couple of sentences out of a newspaper and then craft a scene around those sentences and then come back the next day and those sentences don't stand out like a sore thumb, then maybe I'm doing a good job of crafting my use of the language to fit the time period. So that's kind of a long way of saying pretty accurate, I think is the answer to your question. I'm sure people will call me out on things that I missed, but that's fine. It is a novel.
I have a question about the title.
Yeah.
I have a lot of theories, and possible answers, and I'm trying to figure out why escaping Dreamland.
Yeah. So titles are the hardest thing in the world. I mean, you read the Bookman's Tale. The original title of the Bookman's Tale was Marginalia. When I finally got an agent, he was like, "Yeah, if you want to sell it to 5 rare book dealers, that's a great title." Then it was titled The First Folio, which I never liked, but it was bought by multiple publishers on multiple continents under the title The First Folio. And then it was eventually named The Bookman's Tale after a long conference call that involved my editor and my agent and spreadsheets with tons of ideas for. So the difference between the title and everything else between these pages is that the other 100,000 words, other than those two, if it's 100,002 words, the other 100,000 words is just me and my editor that have to agree on those 100,000 words. Those other 2 words, escaping Dreamland, it's me, my editor, my agent, the publicity department, the marketing department, the design department, booksellers, blah, blah, blah. Everybody wants a piece of that action. But I do, in the end, like the title. To me, the whole book leads up to this long and dramatic scene that happens at Dreamland, and then away from this long and dramatic scene that happens at Dreamland. If the book were a roller coaster, that would be the big hill in the middle of the ride. And what happens at Dreamland is something that all 3 of those characters, Magda, Tom, and Jean, have to find a way to get past. They have to find a way to quite literally to escape it. And Magda, I think especially, towards the end of the book, again, not wanting to give too much away, people haven't read it. But Magda is very much a person who, I think she has a philosophy, and this is another thing that occurred to me reading this book after my father died. I got up and gave a eulogy for him, and I remembered one of the things that I specifically remembered him modeling for me. My mother died when I was 2 years old, when my dad was 29, I think, or 30. And he lived for another 56 years, and was remarried and was married for 53 years to my stepmother. And both in word and action, my father taught me that the tragedies of our life are always going to be there. Those scars will always be there. He will always grieve for the wife that he lost at 29. But that doesn't mean that those scars have to keep us from living a full and happy life. It doesn't mean that they have to completely define who we are. And I think Magda especially learns that lesson. And she doesn't want to forget Dreamland. She doesn't want to forget all the things that happened that summer, but she doesn't want to allow them to rule her life and to push her down and make her depressed or whatever. And so I think maybe that's why escaping. But also it's because everybody who gets to sign off on the title thought it sounded good. I mean, the title is not really there to reflect what actually happens in the book. The title's there to make you pick up the book and read the first page. And the first page is there to make you go, I like this. I think I'll buy it. I mean, that sounds cynical, but it's kind of true. Titles should evoke, I think they should evoke the spirit of the book, the emotion of the book, but they don't need to sort of factually represent exactly what happens in the book.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, I got a question about the Stratemeyer Publishing Company.
Yeah.
I found one of my old Nancy, yeah, I guess it's Nancy Drew mysteries, but it's not Stratemeyer. It's what is it, Grosset and Dunlap?
So yeah, Stratemeyer was a syndicate.
I was old.
Yeah, Stratemeyer was a publishing syndicate. They didn't publish the books themselves. They so Stratemeyer himself, Edward Stratemeyer, would come up with the idea for a series, and then he would write outlines for each book, and then he would send those outlines to ghostwriters. The guy who wrote the first 10 or 12 Hardy Boys books was a Canadian writer named Leslie McFarlane. There is no Carolyn Keene or Franklin W. Dixon or Victor Appleton or Laura Lee Hope or any of those people. But and I think he got paid like $125 a book to write those books. And imagine, you know, if he'd gotten royalties, what that would have been. But Stratemeyer, the Stratemeyer Syndicate, they were like a book packaging company. So they would come up with the idea, they would write the outlines and get the ghostwriter to write the manuscripts, and then they would sell those series on to other publishers. I mean, this was Couples and Leon, I think. Yeah, this one is Couples and Leon. Later on, they did a lot with Grosset and Dunlap when that came on. Grosset and Dunlap was primarily a reprint company. They didn't print, for the most part, original materials. If you find your old childhood copies of Anne of Green Gables or Alice in Wonderland, they're often Grosset and Dunlap reprints. But the Stratemeyer Syndicate was a private family company until 1987, when it was sold to Simon and Schuster. And it's got to be, if not the greatest, one of the greatest publishing successes in American history. I mean, it's just hard to imagine anything like it. Stratemeyer's idea was kids are paying a dime for a dime novel that just falls apart after they read it one time. What if we can give them a hardback book with a dust jacket and illustrations for 50 cents? It's really hard, even in 1906, to make a hardback book and sell it for 50 cents and make any money. But the way you can make money is you sell a whole lot of them. And his idea was kids can save up 50 cents, and they could. And it's really remarkable. You know, there were scores of these series, and he was not the only one who produced them, but he was sort of the king of the hill when it came to that type of publishing. And when I started working on this book, I was going over to visit some friends of mine. He taught romantic poetry at Wake Forest for 50 years or something, and is probably the most erudite person I've ever met. And his wife is a member of the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame and is a very acclaimed poet. And these folks are like literary rarefied air. And I go in and I start telling them, they said, "What are you working on?" And I told them I was working on it. And Ed goes, "Oh, come here, let me show you something." He takes me into the other room, and he's got a whole wall of Stratemeyer books. He's got, Tom Swift, and he's got Bomba the Jungle Boy, and he's got the Electric Motor Car Boys and the Motion Picture Girls, and on and on and on. And he said when he was a kid, his family would go into town, once a month, and he could save up 50 cents in a month. And so once a month he would go buy one of these books. And then later, as a young man, and then even when he had a family, when he was traveling, he would go into used bookstores and fill in the gaps in his collection. So I think that was the point at which I realized that while these books are not necessarily fine literature, they definitely hold an important cultural place that sort of cuts through a lot of strata of society too. I think, lots of different kinds of kids read and fell in love with these books.
You have a part in your book about being impressed with the library that you just described seeing in your friends. Which came first? Did you put that in the book after you went to your friend? I'm just curious.
Probably the fictional one came first. So as I was researching Stratemeyer, I did come across this guy who is supposedly writing a biography of Stratemeyer. He's been working on it for a long, long time. So who knows, if it'll ever happen. And I was reading his blog and his website and reading about his collection. And it was kind of him, even though I've never met him and I've never seen his collection, I've never seen a picture of it. that was a bit of an inspiration. But also, I mean, I'm a book collector myself. I've known lots of book collectors. I know what it's like to go into a book collector's house and have them be excited to show their treasures to you. And so I just had to invent the right kind of collection for this book. But there certainly are plenty of people who collect these books. The prices have gone up and up and up over the years. When I was in the antiquarian book business, all except the very rarest, the first editions of Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew and Dust Jackets, most of them you could buy for, $5 or $10. And, maybe if they had a really nice dust jacket on, it might cost you 15 or 20, but they were pretty inexpensive. And now the early editions have really gone up in value. And I think, like so many things, eventually usually the last people to the party are academia. People in my field in Lewis Carroll, there were incredibly wealthy and erudite people collecting Lewis Carroll almost as soon as he died in 1898, and huge collections put together and given to academic institutions as early as the 1920s and 1930s. And yet you never saw any academic institution offering a course that would include studying Alice in Wonderland until probably the 1970s. I mean, it really was quite a while before academia took children's books seriously as a field of study. And because these books are sort of, as you see in my narrative, these books are kind of looked down on as the trashiest of children's books. They're not well written. They're cranked out fast, and they're formulaic, but those tend to be the last kinds of things that academia is interested in. But they're coming along, and I think I might even mention this in the book. When I was on tour with Bookman's Tale, I went, a friend of mine who was the librarian at Emory University invited me over there and to play show and tell. And one of the most recent things they had gotten was a collection of 4,000 yellowbacks, which is like a British version of the dime novel, these sort of flimsy Victorian paperbacks. And like people were super excited about having this resource in an academic institution as a way of studying popular culture at the time. And also you find that a lot of times people who go on to be established literary authors frequently start their career writing for yellowbacks, writing for boys magazines or girls magazines, things like that. So I think academia will catch up. But that was fun to create a fictional book collector, and then I could put anything on his shelves that I wanted to put on his shelves because he was fictional. So, but if you've read my books before, I like to create libraries because I can put anything I want to in them. I've had actual academic librarians tell me, "Wow, we sure wish we had a collection as nice as the one at Ridgefield University." Fortunately, it's fictional, so you can't use it as much as the real ones.
I also, go ahead. Oh, no. I also wondered, Robert, the contemporary writer, did not like to be asked what he read as a child. And was it that he couldn't admit that because it was so closely associated with his father and how as an adult he couldn't really forgive himself?
Yeah.
The way he behaved as a child. I found that kind of hard to. So,
I mean, I think there were two reasons why Robert didn't like to talk about the writing that formed his background. One was just the difficulty of the relationship with his father and having to sort of go back to that place. But also the fact that he is, I've kind of had this experience. He's thrown into this world as a newly successful author where people ask you the same questions over and over again. And they really expect you to answer them the same way that every other famous author answers them. So when they say to you, what are the books that you love? What are the books that influenced you? They don't want you to say the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. They want you to say Hemingway or Jane Austen or Shakespeare. They want you to be up at the top. And I think Robert has this sense that he can't. Again, we're playing with identity, that he can't be honest about who he really is because the society that he's in expects him to be someone other than that. And that sort of echoes the same thing that's going on with Tom, whose father expects him to go to Princeton and be a banker. And that's not how he sees himself. with Magda, who society expects to go marry somebody and be their housekeeper. That's not what she wants. With Jean, you know, so all of these characters have these moments where they feel that society is trying to thrust an identity onto them that they're not comfortable with. And with Robert, it's that, you know, he feels like he's being buttonholed as, you know, the erudite, sophisticated, successful literary novelist. And he doesn't feel like that. He feels like a storyteller, really. And I think that's another thing that this novel is about. It's just about the importance of story. I think it's Robert who says, you know, that he believes that telling stories is what gives human beings their humanity, you know. And so I think it's sort of both of those things. There's a question in the chat that says, can you tell us more about how the unusual love triangle with Tom, Magda, and Jean developed? Well, you know, if you're a writer, which I'm sure most of you are, and you have three characters in their 20s and they're going to become very close, it's almost not possible to keep it from sliding into a love triangle. But I think, you know, I wanted to create a friendship that was more important than the failed romances within it. I mean, in the play, there's a line in the play that I'm working on where somebody says something like, you know, we became friends and we let love ruin it. Let's see if we can do it right the second time, because the friendship was so important to them. And so the fact that it becomes this love triangle where each of the potential romances is doomed from the start is really a way of putting pressure on that friendship and then allowing dramatic things to happen. I mean, three friends going to Dreamland, that's nice, that's fun. The first half of that day is fun to read. But if the whole novel was that, just three friends having a good time together, it would get a little dull after a while. So how do we create conflict? Well, if we have three people and each one of them is in love with one of the others, and in each case, there's a really good reason why it's not going to work. Wow, we've just created some conflict. We've just created problems that our characters are going to have to overcome, and we've just created this very intense test for their friendship. And you know, will there be a way for that friendship to survive? Will it change? Will it change the way that these characters look at friendship? Will it change the way they look at romance? I mean, you know, so it becomes. That's why I say I felt like everything either flows towards the scene that Dreamland or away from it, because that's the moment at which all three of these doomed romances reveal the fact that they're doomed, and the ways that these characters have sort of fooled themselves into believing that these things are possible, at the risk of this beautiful friendship that they have created for each other. I hope that answers that question.
That was gonna be my question. I had that written down. Oh, well, what about Magda's sister, who suddenly hadn't drowned on the ship? Well, how did that play out, or how did that come about?
So, well, we're into spoiler territory now, so I'll apologize for anybody who hasn't read the book. But you know, one of the first things that I did when I was working on this book is I went to New York. I have a child who lives in New York, and Jimmy and I went down to what we now just call the Lower East Side, but we went down to Kleine Deutschland, to what was in the late 19th and early 20th century the second largest German-speaking city in the world. It went Berlin, Kleine Deutschland, and New York City, and then I think Munich was number 3. You know, and we just explored, and we found the Freie Bibliothek, the free library, which is still there, and it's part of the New York Public Library system, but it still says over the doorway, Freie Bibliothek in German. You know, and we found a number of buildings that still had German inscriptions, you know, over the entrances, old beer halls and things like that. We found the church that was the congregation that went on the Slocum. That church is a synagogue now, because what happened was, after the Slocum disaster, the Germans mostly left the neighborhood. Again, another way to react to tragedy: move away from the things that remind you of the tragedy. So they moved up to Yorkville on the Upper East Side. And the next wave of immigrants were mostly Eastern European Jews, and they moved into the Lower East Side, and it became a Jewish neighborhood. And so what had been this German Reformed Christian church became a synagogue, and is still a synagogue to this day. And then one of the other places we went was to Tompkins Square Park, which is the park that's kind of in the middle of that neighborhood. And off in the corner of the park, in a place where you would only see it if, like me, you were looking hard trying to find it, is this little memorial to the victims of the Slocum disaster. This is the greatest single loss of life in New York City prior to 9/11. And there's just this one tiny little memorial in the corner of a park that nobody except the people who live in that neighborhood go to. And so Jimmy and I went, we found the memorial, we took pictures of it, we looked at it, and I started thinking about this whole idea of Magda balancing understanding the importance of her past, knowing that she has scars, but also wanting to move past that. And of course, that happens most dramatically right at the very beginning, where Magda essentially fakes her own death to create a whole new life for herself, away from Kleine Deutschland, away from all reminders of her family and of that great disaster and everything else. And yet she knows that she has to know that those scars are always there. And so I wanted to, at some point in the narrative, have her interact with that memorial. And then when I finally got her there, I was like, ooh, who else might show up here? Right. This is one of those books where the end was a little tricky, because it's not, I mean, like in the Bookman's Tale and the Lost Book of the Grail and in First Impressions, those are all kind of literary mysteries where the end is finding out the solution to the mystery, right? And that's not until the final page of the Lost Book of the Grail that what Arthur has decided to do. And so this book is more of a character study and a character piece. There are mysteries. I mean, we find out why it is that Robert is so troubled about his relationship with his father, and we find out about Magda's sister and things. But it's not like, okay, it's the last page, here's who did it. It's a little different from that, and it took me a while to realize that as I was working on it. And in fact, the last passage in the book, the last 2 or 3 sentences, which I also am using as the last 2 or 3 sentences in the play, that used to be about 40 pages from the end of the book, through draft after draft after draft. And every time I would get to it, when I was reading through or working on another draft, I would have an emotional reaction to that passage. And finally, I realized this is the emotional reaction that I hope that my reader will have when they set this book down and it's all over. This needs to be the end of the book. This is how I want you to feel when you close the book and it's done. And so I reworked it and rewrote it and moved that passage to the end. And it still gets me. It may not get you. It's okay. It doesn't have to. But it just I love it. I'm hoping it's going to work really well on stage. The way we're staging that is we have it's as if Robert has published his novel, and that's the novel that he's written. And so he's doing a reading from his novel, and so we hear his voice in a voiceover, and as he's speaking, Tom and Magda and Jean just sort of come center stage and hold hands and stand in the light, and then he finishes that speaking, and then the light just fades on them, and that's the end of the play. I hope that's going to work really well. We'll find out. But it's definitely, I can't even remember where this question started. Oh, about Magda's sister. But it's definitely a different kind of ending for me. And so that was it's not that there aren't any surprises. There are some surprises. But the ending is more about I think, an emotional tenor than it is about a plot point.
Continuing on.
Where is your play being produced, Jessica?
So we're actually doing a reading at the end of this month. I've been working with 2 or 3 actors and a director. We've been meeting off and on over the last several months, sort of developing the script. So we have a script now. So we're going to do a reading here. I'm in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So we're going to do a reading here at our local arts center at the end of the month, and that's going to be. We've mostly invited like other theater people who are directors, who are actors, who are producers, who teach theater, who are playwrights, who can kind of give us a professional reaction to the script. And then once we get that done, this has all been sort of semi-commissioned by the local community theater here, the Little Theater of Winston-Salem, which is one of the oldest little theaters in the United States, I'm glad to say. And so we're hoping that it'll be produced by them next season, the 21-22 season, or no, 22-23 season. If all goes well, and then who knows what might happen after that. But it's been an interesting challenge. I mean, obviously you can't build a set that has all these things in it. So we're going to use a lot of projections. We even played around with the idea of calling the play Postcards from Dreamland and having almost all the projections be old postcards of New York City. And we might go back to that. I'm not sure, but it definitely will have that look where the staging itself is very simple, but behind the staging, you will see these sort of vintage images of New York. And we have a framing device, which is totally different. It's Robert's girlfriend is gone. The whole thing with his dad is gone. His dad has just died recently. And he has brought a box of stuff that his dad borrowed from the old lady, from Sarah, back to Sarah's apartment. He's like, tell me what this stuff is. And they start going through the box. And as they're going through the box, it flashes back to Magda and Tom and Jean. So we made some pretty major changes in order to make it work as a play. And we'll find out if it does work as a play. I hope it will. I think it can be. I think it could be a lot of fun. And we added some things into. We gave somebody a song at Tony Pastor's vaudeville house, and we gave Fanny Bryce a song in the Ziegfeld Follies. So there's a little bit of music in there to make it fun. And I've written lots and lots of plays, and I've written lots and lots of books, but this is the first time I've ever tried to take one and turn it into the other. So it's been a really interesting experience. I think we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I have a question. What was your light bulb moment in becoming an author, and what do you dream of exploring yet as a writer?
What was my light bulb moment in becoming an author, and what do I dream of exploring as a writer? Well, I'll take the second one first. I mean, I think to some extent, all my books are about story and the importance of story in our lives. This one maybe more so than the others. I mean, in a lot of my books, I've explored how story moves through time in the person of physical books, which carry with them both a printed story with inside them, but also a story that's the history of that particular object in space and time. It's a story of ownership and of perhaps gifts, perhaps being lost, whatever it might be. So I think story is one of the things that I will always continue to explore. The book I'm working on now is about story, but in a very different way. But to me, that's something that's always going to be there. As far as my light bulb moment as an author, if that means when did I decide I want to become an author? I mean, even as a young, maybe not as a child, but certainly as a teenager, I loved the idea of being a writer. So it's something that's been around for a long time. I think as far as the light bulb moment in terms of something that led to my success, it would have to be, I went to graduate school in writing, and I'm glad I did that. It was a good experience, and I think it helped me become a better writer. But I also feel like, and I've heard other people say this about graduate programs and other artistic endeavors, I felt like I had to get over that. You sit there and you read nothing but the very finest literary fiction for 2.5 years. And when you get done with that, all you really understand how to try to write is the very finest literary fiction. And not very many people can write that, you know. And you have to realize that there are a lot of books in the world, and there's a lot of kinds of writing in the world other than the very finest literary fiction. And that you can take what you learned about writing fine literary fiction and apply it to a mystery about rare books, or a story about Jane Austen, or a story about old New York, you know. And so I think just having that moment that when I realized, instead of trying to write a great American novel, just tell a story. Just find a story that you're passionate about and tell it to other people in a way that makes sense, that they can understand it. That was probably my light bulb moment. I mean, I can remember the day that I got the idea for Bookman's Tale. We were in North Yorkshire in England. The latest Harry Potter book had just come out, and there was 4 of us, and there were only 2 copies of the book. We were passing it around. And when I didn't have it, I went out for a walk. And I had an agent comment on a manuscript that I had submitted at one point. He said, this doesn't really fit into any genre. You need to write in a genre, which is really ironic because it turns out I ended up writing a book that's kind of ex-genre fiction. But and I was walking in North Yorkshire, thinking about the last time I had been in North Yorkshire. Some friends had taken me to this rundown house that had a chapel out behind it with some cool grave markers in it. And I thought, what if there was a rundown house and there was a chapel and there was something cool inside the chapel? And that was the beginning of the Bookman's Tale. And I took a bunch of notes that day, and almost nothing that I wrote down that day ended up in the book, except the idea that there's a rundown house and there's a chapel and there's something cool inside the chapel. That was all that remained. But so you have light bulb moments all the time. I mean, the book I'm working on now came from this one little idea that popped into my head while I was reading another book. And it may turn out it was a bad idea. It may not, I don't know if it'll ever be a published book. You never know. But it's funny how the idea, you know, the more I write, the more the book becomes less and less and less about that original little idea and more about the characters that I've created and the stories of those characters. And the idea is just the thing that got it started. You know, an oak tree is a lot more than just an acorn. You can't make an oak tree without an acorn, but once you get done with it, sometimes you don't even see the acorn that started it. You know, you see something completely new. Let's do one more question if we can, because I think we're coming up on 4:30 here. But if there is one more question, I'd be very happy to.
There's one in the
There is
chat.
one in the
Yeah.
chat, yeah.
Oh, there's one in the chat. Do you know if there were people on the Slocum who faked their own deaths? I certainly don't know of that. I read a lot of newspaper accounts of the Slocum. There were certainly bodies that were never identified. And there is a mass grave in a graveyard out on Long Island. That was, I think, some weeks or maybe even months after the disaster. They had a service, and then they had every year. I thought about sending Magda out there because they had a big service a memorial service out there every year for at least the first 20 years or so. But I just really wanted to keep her in Manhattan. There was just something about having this book, with the exception of when Tom goes to San Francisco early on. But once the 3 meet each other, we only ever see them together, and we only ever see them in Manhattan. And I really kind of wanted to keep it that way. So I don't know. I seriously doubt anybody did that. But I think it would have been pretty easy to do because there were definitely quite a few bodies that were burned beyond recognition and that were never identified. And of course, in those days, they didn't have dental records or DNA or any of the things that we were likely to depend on now. So it does raise this question of having to be very aware of the technology of the period that you're writing in. And honestly, in some ways, is more difficult to write Robert's story in 2010 than it is to write in 1906, because I know that the world of 1906 is totally different from my world. I know I've got to figure out what the cars looked like. Were there cars? How did you get from one place to another? Anything that could potentially involve technology, lights in the theater, you name it, is going to be wildly different. But in 2010, I'm like, all right, when did I get my first smartphone? Did I still have a flip phone in 2010? Like that stuff will drive you crazy. And you'd be surprised how hard it is to find out. Like, when did people start watching Netflix? You know, it's not, you can't look and see like, when did Netflix start? Because no, it's like, when did people actually start watching it? Is that something that Robert would have done in 2010? I'm not sure, was there still, would he still have been going to Blockbuster? You know, these things keep you up at night. But you do have to be aware of the technology of the period, and certainly being aware of the forensic technology of 1906 or 1904 in the case of the Slocum disaster, meant that I knew I was on safe ground, having Magda do that, because they just didn't have the forensic ability to identify a body that was badly burned, especially when in so many cases all the other members of the family were dead also. I mean, it just wiped out the whole community. It was largely women and children, but there were a lot of men on the boat as well. And all of the surnames and Christian names of the German characters in the novel are taken from the lists of the dead from the Slocum. They're not, I mean, I would take a last name from one person and a first name from somebody else, but that was my small way of trying to pay tribute to those lives that were lost on that horrible day in 1904.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure. This around about this time next year, the new novel will be out, or even a little bit earlier. I wanted to write a straight thriller, but there's still old books in it. I can't keep away from that. But it's just a typical story about a small town librarian and a professional assassin who team up to solve a 75-year-old Nazi mystery. So if that sounds interesting to you, then maybe we'll all meet again this time next year. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Keep in touch.
Thank you, because you're the one that
Okay.
put us on to all these.
Carol Jensen used to change all our name tags, right?
Thank you, everyone. If you would like to continue talking, you surely can. I will be ending the Facebook Live, but thank you all for joining us. And you're welcome, like I said, to continue talking here on Zoom if you'd like.
Thank you, Morgan.
So good to see you, Carol, and everybody.
Oh, hi, Beth. You look wonderful.
Yeah.
So do
so
you.
good to see everybody.
Yes, yes.
Ages, nothing cheap. About 3 years.
I see you moved furniture around.
Yeah.
Nice to see you. Oh, yeah, well, we didn't talk about if
You moved, Carol.
we were
How long
gonna.
since you
Oh,
moved?
thank you. Love you all. I will be doing this again next month. I certainly want to read his book. It sounds, he loves what he's doing. That was wonderful.
Mhm.
Bye for now. I'll see if I know how to hang up.
Yeah, that's what's kind of neat about the Zoom stuff, is that you can see people that are
How are you, Barb?
with us, you know.
Good. That's good.
Okay.
Good to see you, Beth, Barb, and Chris on here too.
Oh, yeah. And you know, next month is the Jane Austen one. We're gonna do that, All Roads Lead to Austen, or any book by Jane Austen, so. And you said it was on Hoopla? Yeah, we can get it on Hoopla, so.
You could read Charlie Lovett's book,
And we can read Charlie Lovett's Jane Austen book, right?
First Impressions.
Yeah, yeah,
All about Jane Austen.
it is, yeah. I have read it.
Yes.
It's been a while ago.
Yeah, when we did that back in 2015, so it has been a while.
Thanks for looking all that up, yeah. That was a great introduction. Yeah.
You know, a book that he also wrote was a Christmas book about Scrooge.
About Ebenezer
yeah.
Scrooge,
That was
yeah.
fun.
Yes, there
Yeah,
was.
it was a good one.
Any other comments about the book or anything? Question. Oh, you can't see you guys.
If you enjoyed Charlie's talking, his podcast is really interesting because he interviews other authors. I mean, like big name authors.
Okay.
So it's interesting to listen to an author talk to an author.
I bet, yeah,
So
yeah.
if you go to his website, you can get to that podcast.
Maybe instead of a book discussion, we just listen to a podcast.
Right?
I wonder if Morgan, is there a way we could get that link maybe shared somehow? Or,
The author's podcast,
yeah,
Yeah,
I can look and see. So podcast you listen to based on what you use as your radio in essence. So like I personally use Stitcher, or if you have Apple, you know, so that would be different links depending on which system you use to
Share
listen.
his website link because he's got the podcast embedded on his website.
Okay, I'll look it up and I'll throw it in the chat.
I think I can figure that out.
Yeah. I think it's just charlielovett.com if I had to guess.
And Sandra, you didn't know how it ended.
No, I didn't, and I found out it was this book, I found out where I left off.
Oh, okay.
So I had quite a bit left. And it was interesting because
He's right. We knew there were going to be no surprises. The only thing that kept us going is that when is it going to be shared, or
Yeah.
when is it going to be admitted or
When would it
revealed?
all
Yeah.
come out?
But I thought that was just interesting how that was such a driver
Yeah.
for me. I thought, okay, when are you going to get?
I felt like it was very different compared to his other books.
Oh, I did too, and I liked it.
It was good.
Better, I think.
They're
I mean,
very different.
I related to this one a little more, or maybe it's more understandable. I enjoyed the other ones, but this one was more fun reading, I guess. So,
What did you all think about every street being named and every corner?
yeah,
You know, my granddaughter lives in New York, and so I recommended the book partly because it's good, but she's been on these streets, and for me, it was like, we're walking, and he did that kind of throughout, and it was just, I didn't know how to ask a question about that, but it felt like there had to be some reason exactly.
I thought that authenticness of his writing was the best part.
maybe that's it.
That's, because that's why I asked that question,
Uh-huh.
you know, how authentic are you? And I think that good fiction gives you a good timeline, and it also, it describes things as they happen, really happen. And so I think that authentic history that he used, and the place, and
It grounded it.
it grounded it, yes.
Yeah.
It made everybody, it gave his characters more truth
Yeah.
in their lives. So and you know, city dwellers do walk.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah,
They sure, they
No
don't,
cars,
they don't use cars as much because cars are a burden.
yeah, there's no parking.
Well, that's right, that's, you know, and sometimes, well, like, you know, my daughter lives in San Francisco and she lives in the city and she's raising her family there and everything, so, you know, they had a car, they had a car, and, there's all different things that can happen with a car. You don't even realize that they clean the street, you know, one side at a time, and you have to move your car, and, you know, so anyway, and if you are parked in a spot that only is for certain times, they will actually haul your car away. And so they had this huge, they went away on a vacation, and when they came back, they had like an $800 fee
To get the car.
to get the car back. So, I mean, we don't think like that. We don't, you know, understand things like that. The cities are hard to live in. Different rules.
Our son lost a couple cars like that in Chicago, but one of them just let it go. We were getting it back.
Yeah, well, they sold it because they, you know, they didn't need it. They could get to work, you know, by public transportation, and And then they bought a scooter, Vespa. Oh, and that was much easier.
Well, I'm excited to find out about this play with Charlie. you know.
Yeah, you go on, he's got a Facebook page.
Okay.
I follow his Facebook page, he writes about all that kind of stuff. And if you really like his works, you could go to his website and sign up for his newsletter that talks about all that kind of stuff too. Yeah,
I'm on Louise Penny's
yeah.
newsletter. I'm not happy about this new book that she just
Oh.
wrote. But other than that, I love the characters. Anybody else a fan of her?
Oh, Louise Penny?
Yeah.
Yeah, I read some.
Oh, I've read them all.
Oh. Well, I was reading something really, what was it? Moon over Madeline Island.
Huh.
There's 3 books and this author had written, but he's not anymore, it was that one there. But it's all set in Madeline Island, up by Bayfield, and these ladies decide to escape to Madeline. And they're not literature, but they're fun reading, and because I've been to Bayfield and Madeline Island, it was fun to see the places that you read in. And the girls are hysterical, really, a lot of funny things.
How many books has Charlie written? Well, we've gone through almost all of them here at the book club, like the major fictional novels, but he's written many
There's
other
a lot,
books.
yeah.
You know,
So
it's
according to fantasticfiction.com, which is a great listing of all of the books that authors write in their chronological order and within any collections, it looks like he has 6 novels that he has written, and then he has a few novellas, 2 nonfiction as well, in addition to the 6 fiction. So
Thank you. What website did you find that at?
Fantastic Fiction. So I will put that in the chat as
Oh,
well.
good.
So
I-
the nice
I-
thing,
Well, I connected with Charlie on Twitter, believe it or not. I read The Bookman's Tale, and I went on to Twitter and I tweeted how much I loved it, and I tagged him in the tweet. And he's like, "Great, can I talk at your book club about it?" Like, heck yeah. That's how it started. Great.
Thank you.
Bye.
bye.
Bye.